Well, hello YouTube. It is Coffee Talk with Haze, episode 16. This morning I want to rap with you about power. And I'm going to try to keep it focused on powering your synthesizers. And I'm going to try to keep it as non-technical as possible. But there's going to be a little bit of technicalities here and there. We'll see how it goes. It's not going so well so far, to tell you the truth. This is a very, very hard coffee talk to do. And I think the reason why is because it's something that I want to get technically correct when I'm speaking to you, and I don't want there to be any errors and when I'm communicating to you. But boy, is it hard to do. It is very, very easy to say the wrong term, switch them around. I do it all the time. Everybody does it all the time. I see a lot of technical videos out here on YouTube, and there's a lot of corrections when people are talking in the videos. It's like very easy to say the wrong thing. So bear with me. I guess I should have a quick caveat. Be responsible. If you find yourself wanting to experiment with any of this stuff, I am not responsible for any accidents that may be incurred upon your devices. So be very responsible, be smart. And what I'm trying to do, though, however, is to build confidence in you so that you're not afraid of powering your devices, and so that you don't have a lot of unanswered questions and mystery involving around like, oh my goodness gracious, superstitions involving around like, how do I turn something on? It happens when you don't know what's on the other side, because sometimes things seem to be a little magical, you know what I mean, right? Sometimes you feel like, I'm actually changing the behavior of this thing somehow. Well, maybe there's a little bit of truth to that, but to be honest, I've never been able to recreate anything with accurate science, so for the most part, I find that it's better instead just to educate ourselves. Okay, so let's start with alternating current, because that's what's coming into your residence. And you're going to have a number of devices that are powered with a cable that looks like this. Here we have our 3-prong connector. We talked about this in the last episode. We've got one of the conductors here is for ground, for safety, and on the other side, what plugs into the device, very, very safe. There are no exposed metal parts, so when it plugs in, there's no danger of touching bad things. On this side, there's always a danger. You always want to make sure that this is plugged in all the way. You don't want to leave anything like this with alternating current and 120 volts kind of halfway plugged out, so somebody might actually touch that. Doesn't feel too good. So the devices that are powered directly by alternating current and these kinds of cables are going to have all of the circuitry inside necessary to convert alternating current into direct current, which is needed by the device to be powered, which I would love to get into, but probably can't get into those details right now. So those devices will have a switch on the back of them, a master switch, and that totally cuts off the connection to electricity, to your mains, what's coming in right off the bat. So a lot of questions are like, is it okay to leave my synthesizers plugged in? What's happening when I leave this plugged in? Are they still on? Am I still like drawing? Is the power meter, the money meter, is that cranking away? Am I going to pay more on my electric bill this month because of that? With these devices, it's powered off on the back. The switch is off. It's off. Now there still is a little issue. It's still connected, right? So you don't really ever want to just plug these direct into an outlet. You want to use a power protector like this, which also gives you more options to plug in more stuff, which is okay to do. I'm not going to get into much of that. Steven Mendez has a video that talks all about that, all about like plugging in outlets into outlets and at what point does it become dangerous. I recommend that you should watch that. It's pretty easy to find. I'll try to remember to link it in the description below for you. Good video to watch. Should add a nice compendium to this video, hopefully. So the devices that are powered by this, such as your large synthesizers, my Island Instruments S2400 sampler is powered by this, direct AC. A lot of mixers, most of your mixers, desktop mixers, are going to be powered by this. A lot of rack unit devices are powered by this. In fact, all of my rack unit devices are powered by direct AC and cables, just like this. So I have all of them plugged into one outlet thusly, and then that's plugged into the rest of my gear, and everything's working out okay. So, however, like I said before, you definitely don't want to just keep these devices plugged directly into your wall outlet. Use a power outlet. You've got another kill switch if necessary, and more importantly, what's great is you can just unplug this from wherever it's plugged into. And now whatever synthesizers or samplers or whatever you've got powered that way, you're completely isolated in case of thunder or lightning storm. And you're totally isolated from power transients that way. It would have to be a heck of a spark gap to get across out of your wall outlet into some random plug across the room somewhere. So that's a very, very safe way. If you're leaving your apartment or home for an extended period of time, it's really nice to have a master kill switch and a master plug like that. You can just unplug one thing and know that all your synthesizers are isolated from power for safety. Okay, moving on. The next step up would be devices such as my Alesis SR16. Now this category is kind of rare. These are older devices that are powered this way. And this one, if you look on the back, it just says 9 volt AC, not DC. So it requires a special wall wart, which I have here, one of them, not this one. And I say special with quotes like that because I believe these are the older ones, and all the newer stuff that you see is going to be DC. We'll get to that in a moment. This one is rated at 12 volts. I would not want to power this with 12 volts. It might be okay, but no, I'm not gonna risk it. Not with this, definitely not. Some things, the way that it works is that you never want to use more voltage to power something. Sometimes it can be okay. I've accidentally powered 9 volt devices with 12 volt wall warts before, DC, not AC that we're talking about now, and things have been okay. It's been fine. I'll maybe get into that later, but that's very technical, and that is something that you cannot rely on at all. So as a total rule, not a general rule of thumb, but a total rule, never power a device with more volts than it asks for. We'll talk about current later, hopefully, but that's the most important thing. Hello, bug going across. We might have just picked up a bug on the lens there. That's cool. Okay, so inside of this device, let's back up for a second. Inside of it, well, okay, I'm sorry. Inside of this device, just like the devices that we talked about prior that are powered directly from alternating current, there is circuitry inside that will transform the alternating current into direct current. But the difference is the transformer is right here. I haven't mentioned the transformer yet. So back to your devices like this. Inside of every one of them is going to be a big honking transformer used to step the voltage down 120 volts down to something in the range of 12, 15, 9. And then other things will turn that into DC. We'll talk about that in a second. Trying to keep this very non-technical though. So if you crack this sucker open, which I don't recommend you do, it's cool. If you crack this sucker open, what you will find inside is simply one transformer. So a long time ago, I thought this guy was broken. And instead, it was the wall wart that was broken, which I have here. So I decided, oh, okay. I finally figured out this probably was the culprit. So I cracked it open very carefully without cutting my hand. And if you look very carefully, all this does is it just slides right out of its case. And then here we have one transformer. That's all that's inside of this particular wall wart. Pretty much anything that says on the back of it, alternating current, it's coming out alternating current, it's just going to be one transformer inside. And all it's doing is it's taking the high voltage that's coming out of your power lines into your home, 120 volts if you're here in the United States, and it's stepping it down to a much, much more safer, usable range. We don't need all of that power for these devices. That's why it's electronics. It's really, really cool. I wish I could get more into that, but I'm trying to keep this non-technical. If you look very, very carefully, you'll see there's just two wires here, two conductors, and they're shielded in this nice cable. And somewhere along the way, something in here lost its connection, and that's a bummer because these wires are pretty fragile. If it's on this side, I might be able to get it soldered back together. I should be able to. We'll see. But I'm not worried about that. I have a replacement for it anyways. They're pretty cheap. Like sometimes you can get them for $5. So this is just kind of cool to have as an educational showpiece, as we're doing now. So when I first cracked that open and I saw that, it really blew my mind. But it makes a lot of sense. Like going back, I don't know what I expected. I guess I expected what you would find inside of a regular transformer. We're getting now to our next category. This outputs direct current. And at this point I would like to state that probably the most important thing to take away from this video, if you don't already know how to, is how to read the specifications on these wall warts. The inputs are always going to be the same, but it's the output that you want to the output that you want to pay close attention to. This one outputs 9.6 volts and it supplies only up to 200 milliamps, which is not a lot. And look how big this thing is, and it only does 200 milliamps. I will say this, it's an electro-harmonics, so you can guarantee that the quality on this is going to be super top-notch. They don't joke around over there. That's what I love about that company. They're very high quality. This outlet, this transformer, this wall wart, it's super high quality. And so that's why it's so big, I think, is because they want to have, I don't want to get into this too much, but just think about this for a second, right? You've got 120 volts coming in, and it's all being handled inside of this small unit. So somewhere in there, there's this dangerous zone, and then over here, there's a safe zone. And that is something that's always considered in the design of these things, is that gap between the mains voltage and the actual direct current that you're using to power devices with. And there needs to be a big enough gap, even though it's really, really, really small, a small scale, so that for safety. So I guarantee you that they have safety in their rightest mind. Some of these knockoffs that you get from other countries, even America, even the United States of America, they can be kind of shoddy. I've had a few cheap generic ones go out on me, but they haven't damaged any of my devices. The damage has always just been here. The thing to watch out for is that they don't catch on fire. That's the concern, really. And they'll get warm. So if you're concerned that, oh my goodness, these are getting hot, is that normal? Yeah, it kind of is normal. The less warm, the better, obviously. So that's another concern. You don't want to be operating these like in a really, really hot room if you can help it. It's nice to have some air conditioning for the power to keep things kind of cool down on a general scale. Okay, let's keep moving on. So I want to talk just a little bit about the circuitry that is used to transform the alternating current into direct current. It's actually very, very simple. It's really, really interesting as well. But what we're doing is we're taking a sine wave and we're turning it into a big flat line. That's it. It's very, very, very cool. And this flat line is considered to be 0 hertz, I believe. It's like it doesn't alternate at all, so it's just a solid rail of power. And that is used to, it's necessary for all the internal circuitry for the device to work. Way technical, way beyond what we're wanting to talk about. But this gets us into our final classification of power, and that's these little jobbies right here, which have the little USB thing on the back of them. And if you notice, one thing that's very, very interesting is that all of these wall warts that I've shown you are only 2-prong. And not only that, the prongs are the same size. One is not bigger than the other. So you can plug this in one way or turn it around, plug it in the other way. It doesn't matter. That's kind of cool. Now, what about safety? What happened to the 3rd prong? Well, we really don't need it. Now, this kind of concerns me a little bit, but it's interesting. I think the reason why we don't need it is because everything that's happening is right here. When I plug a USB cable into this, right, what I'm dealing with at this point over here is only 5 volts. All of these, by the way, these USB wall chargers that you see, they're always going to output 5 volts. So let's talk a little bit about voltage ranges just real quick. You've got some standard voltage numbers. You've got 5 volts, so all of your digital stuff only needs 5 volts, period. So a lot of digital synthesizers can get by with only 5 volts. Excuse me, take the Microfreak for example, and I'm out of coffee. The Microfreak, if memory serves me correctly, has a DC jack on the back of it that's rated for 12 volts DC. It also can be powered via its USB jack, which is 5 volts. And there's no issue powering it at 5 volts. So why in the world they chose to power it with a 12 volt wall wart, it just totally boggles my mind. Now, let's talk about the Soulsby at Megatron, which at this point is kind of a rare synthesizer. I don't know if a lot of people really know about the synthesizer or not. It is a Arduino-based synthesizer, and teensy synthesizers will also fall into this category. Actually, let me back up a little bit. They're even better. But an Arduino only needs 5 volts power. You can also go off with 3 volts. The teensy only needs 3 volts. From what I understand, you don't power it with 5 volts at all. 3 volts, 0.3 to be specific. But the Soulsby at Megatron that uses the Arduino, and the Arduino only needs 5 volts, that, like the MicroFreak, also takes 12 volts at its DC jack. However, I've determined that that synthesizer is really using that 12 volts, and you do want to power it with 12 volts. It doesn't have an option to power it with USB anyways. It has a header pin connector, like a standard sort of like header pin connector, which is used to program the Arduino. There's no USB interface for that sucker at all. And that 12 volts is necessary for headroom, for the bass filter, whatever you want to call it, just for the filter, just all the headroom that's necessary for that, and being able to handle the bass response that it kicks out. And it's a beefy little synthesizer, I do believe, as a result of that. So that's a pretty cool little side there. I hope that kind of helps throw things together. But back to these little guys. So these always output 5 volts, and if you break one of these open, these always kind of look very, very similar. They look like this. This is what's on the inside minus the prongs. And the prongs kind of connect into these little parts right here. But if we look very carefully, we'll see that we have 2 sides. Down at the bottom is all the mains voltage, and up here at the top is where the 5 volts come out. Let me let this truck pass for a second. It's a yellow truck, how appropriate. And these yellow bits right here are the transformers. Tiny, tiny little transformers. Now think about this for a second. Look at the gap between 120 volts and 5 volts. If you look very carefully on the back here, you can see, the difference. There's a channel here on YouTube called Diode Gone Wild. It's a great name, great channel. Very technical, very, very, very technical stuff. He likes to tear apart these chargers and rate them all the time. And he rates them on a scale from super dodgy to acceptable. It's really cool stuff. And most of these are super dodgy, by the way. So when it comes to these guys, yeah, I think I'm going to go with name brands over generic, because again, look at the difference here. Look how much space you've got between 120 volts and 5 volts. We don't really think about these things, but something else you might not think about, when you got a lamp right next to you and that little switch that you're pulling, there's 120 volts going right through that switch. And where your finger is connecting that's 120 volts right there. We've been doing this our whole lives, so okay. So where can we go from here? It's very interesting. There's all kinds of ways to connect power to your devices. And the best way is a standard way. So we have special jacks for that. We have these little DC barrel jacks, such as this one. And you could purchase these on Tata, such as this. And if you look very carefully, we've got one of these little jobbies that comes out here and has an eyelet connects to the outer part, and another one connects to the inner part. I think I talked about this a little bit in the last video, you remember? And if you think about it for a second here, like, we can make a choice. We can put the positive wire here, or we can put the positive wire here, we can put the ground wire here, or we can put the ground wire here. We can't put them both on the same one. That's always bad. So we can make these center positive or center negative if we want to, which is what we should talk about next. So what's the difference between center positive and center negative? Well, I just explained it to you. That literally is all that it is. Now, there is one kind of weird concern, and that is that when things are center negative, well, that means that this outer part right here is the hot. Now, it's only going to be 9 volts, 12 volts. It may get interesting if things jump up to 24 volts. I do have a guitar pedal that takes 24 volts for power. And I haven't experimented with touching this thing. I guarantee if you touch this to your tongue and short it somehow, you're going to feel it. So that is one concern. Another concern is if you do have something that is center negative, such as this, like any of your wall warts that are center negative, and if you have it plugged into the wall, oh, it's another thing I should talk about, is leaving these plugged into the wall. But if you have it plugged into the wall, now your hot, right, is over here, so you want to make sure that you don't accidentally, you know, touch some audio cable like that with that. So that is one concern about center negative. I think a general rule of thumb is just to don't leave these hot and dangling center negative, center positive, either case, because, you know, it's just good practice. But going back to an aside, it's what I missed out on is it okay to leave these plugged into the wall? Hang on a second. How you doing? Good. Long time no see. Hope everything's doing well. Awesome. Okay, so these, no, you don't want to leave these plugged into the wall, because they are always trying to rectify that alternating current into direct current. Even though there's not a load, hate to get technical on you, but a load pulling or drawing current from it, there's still something going on. And in fact, a lot of these, well, not a lot of them, but some of the wall warts have a little indicator LED, and that should be an indicator, is that when it's plugged in and it's still on, it's still on. It is drawing very, very little current. It's something that they call quiescent current. There's a specification that tells us how much it's drawing when no load is actually, or even if there is a load attached, but the load is not really actively doing anything with the power. And it's always going to be like very, very low, like maybe 10 milliamps, which is like a trickle of nothing. But still, it's something. It is something. And what we're talking about here is that these generate heat, and they have a lifespan inevitably. There are certain components on them that will die out over time, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. You know, so again, going back to our power outlet that has a little ant on it right now. Don't go inside, little ant. It's great to have these plugged into here. The problem, of course, is that we run out of room. Now, if you have one of these power strips and you see that it has this little thing on here that says transformer, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, what that means is that this is specifically for any wall wart. It's just space. There's nothing really special. This is no different than any of the rest of them, at least it shouldn't be. It's just they're giving you a little more space so that you can plug in something like this. Hey, wouldn't it be better if all of these said transformer and had equal amount of space on them so you could plug in transformers to all of them? It may be giving you an idea that they don't want you to do that, however. Go check out Stephen Mendez' video for more on that to dispel a lot of those myths. Okay, so from here, let me kind of catch my breath for a second, and because we're not done, we're almost done, but let's have a little bit of fun here, hopefully, with some of this stuff. But I think I've gone over, like, you know, why these are two-pronged. Here's another one that you may see sometimes. These are pretty cool. These are like a specialized version of these, which are good and bad for a number of reasons. Like this one has I want to say that this is a USB-B micro, not mini, but a micro. The problem with these is that if anything happens to this cable and it finally breaks out, it's kind of toast, really. Whereas with something like this, you can plug in any number of cables, and it's up to the, you know, if the cable is broken for whatever reason, then you can just use another cable. So that's the only problem with these. This is the one that came with my Squirt Pyramid, so that was kind of cool. As you can see, I'm not using it. I may do a video on the Squirt Pyramid another day. Probably won't. Okay, so what I want to get at though, yes, center negative and center positive. So what's up with that, right? What is up? Why do they do that? What's going on? Well, it's guitar pedals. And believe it or not, I've already explained this. I did a DIY guitar pedal video. It was in part 3 that I explained the wiring of the switch within the guitar pedal and how the 9-volt battery is hooked up to it. And again, you know, there's this even though this DC jack has 3 prongs, it has nothing to do with the 3 prongs on this AC connector. The third prong is a safety ground thing. The third prong on this is a switch thing, so that if I plug in something, I break that switch. It's a convenience. It allows me to piggyback and do certain things with the power. So in other words, if I plug in a battery, it breaks whatever, if I plug in a wall wart, it'll break the it'll break the connection to the battery inside the guitar pedal. Now, again, you're not going to be satisfied with this answer. You have to watch the video. I would love to go back and redo this and try to figure out a way to condense this answer down to something that's much more easy and palatable to chew on. But breaking all things aside, the reason why these are center negative is because if it were center positive and you plug the battery in inside your guitar pedal, it would immediately drain the battery. It would just short the connections to the battery. And it's just a choice that they made. The designers of the DC jacks, not the designer of guitar pedals. So what we end up with are a bunch of center negative guitar pedals. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to the 9-volt pedals, I have more center negative than center positive, by far. It's okay for the most part because it seems like most synthesizers are powered with 12 volts. So you could argue that the standard size wall wart is 12 volt center positive. I argue that it's 9 volt center negative. I think they're both pretty much equally popular. And here's the cool part though. What happens if you run out of center positive wall warts? All you have are center negative. Well, this is a convenient little female DC jack. Same thing if I want to. I've already used this one. I need to clean it up, remove these wires, these conductors. I can wire this to be center negative. And now, when I plug in, let's pretend that this center negative wall wart is center positive. With this, if I had it, wired up and everything, well, this one doesn't fit. What a bummer. Darn you, Electro-Harmonics. But let's say I was using this jack instead. Boom. You see what I'm getting at? I can use this as an adapter to convert any center negative into center positive, or any center positive into center negative. It's a convenience. But again, be very careful if you do this stuff at home. I have to say it, don't do this stuff at home, so that way I'm not responsible. Okay, so things get kind of weird, right? Because like I said before, we can use any connector that we want to power stuff. We probably shouldn't. Now, I'm not trying to blame these guys. Division 6 made this really awesome business card sequencer. I love this thing. This is a kit that I put together myself, one of the first kits that I put together. It was actually a pretty challenging little kit. It has a lot of solder points, so it's a really, really good starter, I think. And it's interesting because this will allow you to power, it says on the front here, anywhere from 7 to 15 volts. Now, for convenience, they used an audio jack. So one of the first things that I did actually was wired up my own little battery connector into an audio jack. This thing is super dangerous. It's not very wise to hook a battery in this and go around hooking this in the audio jacks, but that's how this is. Now the problem, I might get a little technical here, is that when I cross the gap here, for a brief moment I'm shorting these two connectors. Just for a brief moment, and that's shorting the battery, so it's giving a little bit of a pop, and that's kind of bad. But hey, nothing is stopping us from using any connector we want to supply power. Again, please don't do this. It's just not a good idea. It's best to stay standardized so that people look at something and they say like, oh yeah, this is for power. I mean, in fact, if nothing else, I can't plug this into any audio jack. In fact, I can't plug this into every DC jack. These are all different sizes, as you may have already noticed. Korg Volkas use a different size, and I've got some adapters that I found on Amazon that are great. You just slip them right over, just kind of like this, and plug them right into your Korg Volkas. The Korg Volkas are center positive. So yeah, you just have to make sure that you know which is which. Now what happens if you plug a center negative into a center positive, or a center positive into a center negative? Well, there should be negative voltage protection, reverse voltage protection. All of these devices are consumer devices, and it just is unacceptable for anybody to be selling something like that if you plug the battery in the wrong way, it's going to blow the device. Now, if I had a battery like this, and if I even so much as touch the positive to the negative, and the negative to the positive, like this, and this is plugged into something. Bam, I can destroy components inside of that device if that device did not have reverse voltage protection. I don't know anybody out there that doesn't have reverse voltage protection. There may be some modular, some DIY stuff, like if you buy something from somebody off the street that's building something for the first time, you know, they may not know about these things, but you know, this is why I say don't try this stuff at home unless you really know and you're really willing to risk sacrificing that device for an experiment that's not worth it. Don't try this at home. You know, if you can open it up and you know what to look for, a voltage regulator, a diode that's doing reverse voltage protection, then you can understand better, you know, like number one, yes, I can use center negative accidentally. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to power the device, so you don't want to do that anyways. But in terms of using more voltage, sometimes you can get away with that if you know what to look for, a voltage regulator. Okay, I'm about to wrap this up, but I want to show you a couple fun stuff, hopefully. I think I've covered everything that I need to. One of the things that always, I don't know how to state this nicely, so I'm not going to, but I hear all the time on the internet like, oh man, it's a shame that that device isn't battery powered. Oh, it's a shame that they didn't put a battery pack in there or anything, you know? So, like, let's take the RD6 for example, right? You know, there's no battery pack or anything like that. You can mod it to put a battery, anything. You don't need to do any of that. This is rated, if you look very carefully, we'll see that it's center negative 9 volts. So I kind of applaud Behringer for having center negative 9 volt because I think that those are a lot more common to find. So what I have is a special battery clip that I wired myself. I paint these blue, that's my indicator that it's center negative. For me, blue is my indicator of negative voltage. It's just what I use, and red is what I use conversely for center positive. So when I'm making my own cables and my own battery clips like this, it's important that I visually know center negative or center positive, and this is a great way to do it. So if you look very carefully, I've got my battery snap here, and look, there's a DC jack. So wow, I've got 9 volts into a DC jack. Does it work? Excuse me, bug. Why, yes it does. It powers up. And so now I'm going to take this USB speaker that I have here and not drop it into the phone jack for convenience, and hopefully, oh, might help if I turn the speaker on. Here we go. Sorry, wrong pattern. Okay, so as you can see, this battery did power my Behringer RD6. Turn it off, unplug the battery. Pardon there's any rumbling. So one more thing before we go. What happens if I use a battery to power the SR16? Well, you're not supposed to, obviously. I'm trying to get the RD6 in a safe place without destroying my coffee cup in the process. Now this one, I can tell you right off the bat that if I try to power it with 9 volts center negative, it's not going to turn on. However, if I I can't talk. If I power it, that's hard to say. Power it with center positive 9 volts. It turns on. Now here's the problem. Even though it powers, it will not produce meaningful sound. Now you're probably not going to be able to hear this. I'm going to try to turn the speaker up. I might work with the audio on post, because what I did there was very dangerous to do during a filming. You could barely hear it. What's going on? You hear this kind of bzz, bzz. It's like the sound is sputtering and fuzzing out. Let me turn this off. You heard a little pop just then as I turned it off too. Really, the moral of the story here is that you really probably shouldn't try to power this with a direct current wall wart or a battery, which by the way is direct current. and you should only use the rated wall wart for really all of your devices. But hopefully I've shown you that that's not entirely true. As long as you understand the rules, you can break them. You can sort of like, there's a fudge area that you can play around with and not damage your devices. As always, don't do it unless you know darn well that it ain't gonna break it. That's the only advice I can give you with this stuff. Your best rule of thumb is to use the rated wall warts with your synthesizers and just to play it safe. So I hope all that made sense. Probably that's just going to leave a whole bunch of questions in your head, and that's really what I'm trying to do, is just plant a bunch of seeds so that when you actually come across this stuff, you go, oh, aha, that's what he was talking about. Ah, He-Man, you are such a tryhard.